Hi, I'm Lynn Blend. I'm a drag queen, a Vtuber, and a true crime enthusiast. And normally I look into historical true crime cases, but today we're going to be looking into a related topic, tangentially. The resurrection men, professional grave robbers in the 19th century US and United Kingdom, who would make their living by selling corpses to medical schools. I got a comment on my H.H. Holmes video from the lovely Salika, who's a supporter of mine on Ko-Fi. Thanks, Salika! Side note, you can support me on Ko-Fi for as little as $3 a month, or do one-time donations as well, and you can see all my videos early and ask me questions that will influence my future videos, just like this one. So Salika asked about H.H. Holmes. Wait, he sold corpses to the medical school? I'm astonished that this did not raise serious red flags in the community. And when I read that, I immediately thought about the resurrection men. The fact is, Holmes selling corpses to medical schools didn't raise any alarm bells because this was actually a very common practice at the time. Today, human dissection is a common part of a doctor's training in medical school, but in the past, it was a very controversial practice. Nowadays, medical schools obtain cadavers for dissection from people who donate their bodies to science, but the systems we have in place today that allow someone to consent for their body to be used in this way have not always been in place. Now, during the 19th century, there was even more of a demand for cadavers for human dissection than there is today, and this was for a few reasons. There were a lot of things about the human anatomy that were only just being discovered, and to do this medical research, dissections were necessary because, they didn't have the imaging technology we have today. Dissections were also performed as entertainment. Not only medical students, but members of the public would attend. The problem was there were not enough legal means to have enough supply to meet this demand. In the eyes of the law and in the general public, human dissection was a very controversial practice. Doing anything that would destroy the body was seen as very disrespectful to the dead. The only bodies that were legally able to be dissected were the bodies of recently executed murderers. And as you can imagine, that doesn't happen really often. There's not a lot of opportunities there. There was also the issue of decomposition. Because refrigeration wasn't a thing at this time, any dissections would have had to happen within a few days after death. This put a lot of restriction on how far bodies could be moved and how much could be done before they were too far decomposed to work with anymore. And this is where the resurrection men come in. Since there was no other legal source to acquire bodies for human dissection, the only way was illegal sources, like grave robbing. Medical schools were in such dire need of fresh bodies that if someone just, happened to bring them one in the middle of the night, they wouldn't ask too many questions about it. Not only that, but they would pay well enough that people could make a living doing this, and they did. The rewards pretty well outweighed the risks, since even if somebody was caught grave robbing, it was only a misdemeanor instead of a felony. Not only was this a relatively easy way for a group of criminals to make money, it was pretty common. Professional grave robbers had to get the process of digging up a grave and escaping with the body down to a science in order to not be caught. They would dig up the grave on one side, throwing the dirt they were digging onto a tarp, drill holes in the coffin to make it easier to break the lid open, and then use either a rope tied around the corpse's neck or a chain with a hook on it on the end to pull the body up out of the grave. A crew of experienced grave robbers could get into a grave, get the body out of there, close the grave back up, and flee the scene in under an hour. Since corpses had to be very recently dead in order to be dissected, it was pretty common for resurrection men to hire women to go undercover to funerals in their local area, and they would have these women pretend to be the deceased distant family so they could case the cemetery for targets. Grave robbers would go after graveyards that had poor security and target individuals that they basically thought wouldn't be missed. It was really common for them to target the graves of poor people or even go after historically black cemeteries. The black communities who were burying their dead there wouldn't have had the resources to provide extra security for the graves of their loved ones, and their complaints were taken a lot less seriously when they would speak up about it, unfortunately. Medical schools got so accustomed to having this extra help getting cadavers for dissection that they would often have a secret entrance where grave robbers would come in to discreetly deliver bodies. It was more or less seen as an open secret within the medical community. The anatomists and medical students who were doing the research basically saw grave robbing as a necessary evil, since there really was no other way for them to get as many bodies as they would need to do the work that they were doing. Even though grave robbing was widely practiced at the time, it was definitely not seen as acceptable by the general public. And as you can imagine, most families were upset at the idea of their loved ones' bodies being stolen from their graves. So there were a lot of different methods they would use to counteract this. One relatively easy, if kind of nasty way to do it was to keep the body in the home until it was too far decomposed to be dissected. Families with more time or money to spare would either hire guards or have a family member stand watch at the graves of their recently deceased. There were also a lot of attempts to create a device or security system that would ward off grave robbers. A mausoleum provides more security than the average grave, but for those who were buried underground, sometimes a cage or a barrier called a mort safe would be built around the grave. They would also use iron caskets, since they were much harder to break into than a wooden casket. And if you look at graves from this time, you'll often see a large stone slab covering the entire area of the grave instead of just a headstone, and this is also a measure to prevent the grave robbing. Some families would even set up elaborate traps with tripwires or alarms to catch grave robbers. I found this device called a coffin torpedo that was patented in 1896, and this device was planted in the casket before it was buried, and it was essentially a spring-loaded bomb. The coffin torpedo would be rigged to explode if the casket was forced open, which would most likely kill any would-be grave robber. One of the most notable resurrection men in the US that I could find was William Cunningham of Cincinnati. He was known for being particularly bold in his grave robbing endeavors. When he would steal a body, he would dress it up and sit it next to him in his wagon, and if he ran into any people while he was transporting the body, he would talk to the corpse like it was a living person, like it was a real Weekend at Bernie's situation. There was even one incident that I read about where he was caught robbing a grave, but he willingly went with the men who captured him, bought them a round of drinks at a tavern, and seemingly bonded with them enough that they believed him when he promised them he'd leave the grave alone. So they let him go, and then he immediately went back, broke his word, went back to the graveyard, and stole the body anyway. In London, one of the most famous gangs of resurrection men was led by John Bishop. Over the course of about 12 years in the early 1800s, Bishop and his gang stole over 1,000 corpses. By 1831, they had resorted to murder to get more bodies to sell. They're confirmed to have killed at least 3 people, but they were only caught when they tried to sell the corpse of a 14-year-old boy they had murdered. The anatomists at King's Cross University that they tried to sell the body to were immediately suspicious of this, and they reported it to the police, who discovered the truth behind the plot. A really interesting case that I found from Edinburgh is the case of William Burke and William Hare. Now, I'd love to actually do a whole video on them at some point, if y'all would like, so I can go into more detail. But I'll give a bit of a brief rundown about the case here. Burke and Hare met each other when Burke moved into Hare's lodging house in Edinburgh in 1827, and the two of them became friends. Their crimes started late in that year when one of Hare's tenants died unexpectedly while owing him rent money. Together, Burke and Hare decided to make up for that loss by stealing the tenant's corpse and selling it to the university. When they did this, and they realized how much money they could make selling bodies, the pair decided to create more bodies to sell by killing people. They would suffocate their victims so as not to damage their organs, and this would also make their cause of death more difficult to determine. Before they were caught in 1828, Burke and Hare had killed 16 people and sold their corpses to the university. One of the most high-profile cases of grave robbing in the US involves the body of John Scott Harrison. This incident proved that this could affect anyone. John Scott Harrison was an Ohio senator and the son of the 9th president William Henry Harrison. When John Scott Harrison died in 1878, his grave was enclosed in brick, covered in stone slabs, sealed with cement, and supposedly under guard for 30 days. But even that didn't keep the grave robbers out. The night of his burial, Harrison's body was stolen and sold to the Medical College of Ohio. This was discovered the next day when Harrison's son visited the college and discovered the body of his own father hanging in storage, his head covered with a cloth. In the wake of this discovery, stricter laws were passed against grave robbing, but even this didn't deter the Resurrection Men, and they were active well into the 20th century. So that's the story of the Resurrection Men. It always makes me very glad that there's systems in place for ethical human dissection now. Coming up next, I'll be continuing my playthrough of Famicom Detective Club, The Girl Who Stands Behind, as well as a deep dive into British serial killer John Christie, who was active in the 40s and 50s. Special thanks to both Salika and Smallsy, who support me monthly on Ko-Fi. If you would like to support me on Ko-Fi, you can do so at ko-fi.com/spinnblend. You can do either one-off support or sub-monthly on there, and you get perks like seeing all of my videos early, or you can also join my Sub with Month Club on there. Thanks so much for watching!